Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Tuesday, and oh yeah, it's Washington D.C., that twilight zone area from which I can never escape. And I'm here in the Hotel Washington. You can check in anytime you like, but you can never leave. It's day 81 of the Proud Boys trial. The jury still has the case. They will begin their fifth day of deliberations today. We got a startling note from them yesterday. The timestamp on it was 8:53. We didn't even know they were in the building yet, and they were announcing the schedule of their conflicts for the next 2 weeks. This one had to be somewhere on the 5th. This one had to be, and we're like, the next 2 weeks. So I mean, it was like, wow. We'd all reassembled from our various points around the country, and I think we're all hoping to go home at some point and remain home. In fact, Roger Roots, the lawyer who was on the team from Montana, returned to Montana this morning. He just can't stick around anymore. But we've got Miami represented, New York represented, Baltimore represented, Connecticut represented, Maryland represented. And we will continue to wait. Today, as I say, will be the fifth day of jury deliberations. It wouldn't surprise me to have a verdict today. And you'll say, well, what about that note with the 2 weeks of schedules? You can never, ever draw a meaningful conclusion from a jury note.
Yeah, I saw one of your tweets yesterday, and I should have brought that up. But do you remember what you said?
Yeah, I do actually. So we're sitting in the lawyer's lounge yesterday, and what does this mean, and what should we do, and could it mean this, and could it mean that? And I'm like, yeah, it could mean anything, And I reminded everybody of a story. A friend of mine many years ago was trying a civil rights case. That is a case against a public official for violating a person's constitutional rights. And she asked the jury for a significant amount of punitive damages, I believe millions in punitive damages. And the jury at one point sent a note after several days of deliberations asking the judge for further instructions on punitive damages. And the judge gave them those instructions. And moments later, the jury sent a note, can we get a calculator? And my friend was like, yes, what can this possibly mean other than I'm going shopping? And then shortly after the calculator went in, the jury returned a verdict in favor of the defense, and she got nothing. And so,
I love the proposition there. Stay calm and stay out of their way.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that is the goal. I mean, the trial of a lawsuit is a very complex affair because you've got to coordinate the activities of so many people. And so when the trial is going on, the judge is the manager of the jury and the participants' time. And the judge makes the final decision about what will happen and when. And that is the judge's role. Once the case goes to the jury, the focus of energy turns to the jury, and it is the jury who controls the case and the jury who decides it on their own time, in their own way, and privately. And so they will send out notes from time to time, and the court will either respond to those notes or not, depending on what the law is or what the question is. But the participants, you can't help but wonder. So I'm down in the courthouse cafeteria yesterday, grabbing a bagel and a cup of coffee before I head up to a secret room to read cases. And some trial watchers came up to me and said, "Well, what does all this mean?" And I said,
Bless you.
Thank you. I'm allergic to myself as always. I've got norm toxicity. Well, hey, I share that with many people. That's why I'm going into a sideline on May 18th at the Mohegan Sun, where I'm going to do a whole comedic riff on what it'd be like to be a coffin salesman. More about that later. But I said, you can't. The problem with a jury out is you can't help but wonder what everything means. But you have to be modest enough to realize that your wondering means absolutely nothing. Be ready for surprises. Let the jury do its work and be patient. So, we will be patient today.
Well, I'm reminded of a podcast episode that we produced, maybe a couple of years ago now. I remember driving through the country. Do you remember when I was trying to record you and Mr. Jim Nugent?
Oh, yeah.
While I was way out in the sticks here in North Cac. And the two of you were talking about the art of jury selection and the science of jury selection. And he, of course, does stuff on the civil side. So there's, I wouldn't say that there's a one-to-one comparison for the two of you when you're having those types of conversations. But I think that for these purposes, a 4-month plus long trial, hundreds of exhibits and materials for the jurors to wade through, it is a fool's errand. to try and read the tea leaves with such insignificant details. You know, when you pull all the way back, you think after, you know, this enormous amount of information flows their way, and that for some reason, you know, hey, oh, what's the trial calculator? Like, hey, can we have a trial calculator? Like, oh, we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it.
And no, I mean, I'm a skill. I've waited. I think I mentioned this to you the other day. I've waited for verdicts 9 days twice. And Jim, who you mentioned, you know, Jim Nugent, he waited once 13 days. And at the end of the 13th day, it was no verdict. They couldn't agree. In my case, at the end of 9, we had verdicts in both instances. So we could be here a while longer. I'm hoping to get home someday. I'm hoping that while I sit down here, I don't get so agitated, antsy, and concerned about what's going to happen next that I turn to drinking. That because I don't think I could bear to drink Bud Light right now. If I opened a can of Bud Light, I'd see Dylan Mulvaney's face on me, and I would have like morbid, subliminal psychiatric fantasies of a shark going for my nuts. You know, I just couldn't touch a can of Bud Light right now. But what's going on with Bud Light?
Well, a lot's going on with Bud Light, and I don't want to use this as an opportunity to recast the whole thing, but for those who have been loosely following or who have heard about it, Bud Light, which is a, you know, well-known, I say well-known as an understatement, right? It is one of the brands that are synonymous with American beer, although it's not necessarily American anymore. Anheuser-Busch merged with InBev, and now it's a multinational corporation. AB InBev, as it's known, is the supplier, the producer of a number of brands.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's me again. Whiskey's better, but anyhow.
But for all intents and purposes, we've got Budweiser, Bud Light, Kona Brewing, Michelob Ultra, Natural Light, Busch Light, Stella, Landshark, Hoegaarden, Shock Top. Any of these brands that I'm saying that you recognize, those fall underneath the Anheuser-Busch InBev umbrella. And that says nothing of the many, many craft brands that Anheuser-Busch also owns all over the country. Things like Tin Barrel, things like Wicked Weed, things like Blue Point. And I just named California, North Carolina, and New York. So you can start to understand the size and scale of AB InBev's production operation. What's going on with Bud Light right now is unique. And I think it's unique for a couple of reasons, but in particular, you know, Bud Light, as compared to its counterparts, Miller Lite and Coors Light, owns roughly double the market share of those other two respective brands. And what we're seeing here, you see on the screen, I've got Barron's report that Bud Light has fallen 26%. And I guess the week ending April 22nd. And I think that if you split that fall, right, it's basically 13 and some points apiece between Miller and Coors picking up share, or at least growing. I don't want to say share, but at least growing. And the reason I said that I wanted to make a statement today about this is because I'm finally in a place as someone who acknowledges that I can be sort of overwhelmed with minutia and details of the business of beer because of the nature of what I do on a day-to-day basis by and through my practice.
A nerdy jerk, in other words. Not that I would ever identify with it.
You know, I try to be self-aware enough to try and back up, and in the same way that I would advise my craft clients, right? Because culturally, there's this thing that happens in beer these days where proprietors of craft breweries get annoyed or irritated that someone would come in and say, what do you have that's close to Bud Light? Or do you have a Bud Light? Or do you have something like that?
Yeah. What do we have that's close to Bud Light? A urinal, but you wouldn't want to drink out of that, you know?
How is it, Norm, that you expect to convert someone to be a patron of your beer more than the one time if you take the position that they're sort of like the unwashed masses, right? That they're not enlightened to the sensibilities of craft beer and the quality and blah, blah, blah. So in the same respect, I try to give this conversation a little bit of room to breathe, as I say, and develop. And what's happened is that I've watched those that I tend to agree with, the likes of Tim Pool in particular, who has just run this really lean argument that Bud Light needs to apologize, that we as Americans are owed an apology for what's gone on. And I think that if this is what we demand culturally are a bunch of apologies. We're in a really weird place as a society.
No, wait a minute. So Tim, so Mr. I want to be an individual. I'm opposed to identity politics. Not everybody needs a ribbon. Not everybody owes an apology. Now says that Middle America needs an apology because what? We were triggered by their, I mean, look, I would take my money elsewhere if Bud Light's going to start going to trans beers or whatever. I get that, but I don't feel like I'm owed an apology.
And you're not going to get an apology. Let's be very clear. You're not going to get an apology, but you shouldn't have. And this is something early on I said, look, this apology campaign stuff is really dark, and you're not even getting at the essence of what this issue really reflects. Here's what this issue reflects, Norm. And there's a gentleman that owns Beer Business Daily and Craft Business Daily, Wine Business Daily. His name is escaping me. Schumacher is his last name. Highly recommend. Beer Business Daily is actually quoted in this article. Industry trade publication. They work a lot in the wholesale tier. And for those of you that are new to the beer game or any sort of alcoholic beverage distribution game, it's 3 tiers because you have producer, wholesaler, retailer. State laws all over the country basically isolate these tiers from one another to prevent market manipulation, monopolization, and to promote the interests of public health. Because, if there's someone as giant as AB that's able to suppress prices at retail, drive out competition, it makes beer and booze cheap. We've seen in history that certain aspects, the baser parts of ourselves can develop. Gambling, prostitution, organized crime, all develop around vices. And the cheaper the vices are, the easier it is to profit off of those other things. So anyway, just that quick disclaimer. But what's going on here is that Bud Light is realizing the long tail of the decision it made a few years ago to locate its marketing and sales function from St. Louis into Manhattan, New York. And for years, forever. I mean, we're talking about the brands that were emblazoned on Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s car, right? Budweiser as a campaign has been around in NASCAR, which, has had its own identity crises over the last several years. But what we're seeing right now is that the real calling card of the Bud Light controversy is that the average customer does not care to be moved into this conversation, Norm. It's not that the average customer cares one way or the other about who Dylan Mulvaney is or is not, or even knows what the name means, or even understands what TikTok is. It's that the average customer cares not to be moved into a discussion that is political in nature in connection with their decision to drink a beer.
Well, I get that entirely.
And here's how that manifests. And here's why you're not going to get an apology, Tim. We're not going to get an apology, right? We're going to get millions and millions of dollars on new consultants and marketing spend to realign Bud's portfolio with what? The long tails of distribution and the retail chain partners who have been absolutely burned by the fact that an isolated bubble of Manhattanites in New York that thought that promoting this brand and forcing people into a conversation that they didn't want to have was not an appreciable risk. We are 5 weeks into this, Norm. We are 5 weeks removed from this being a headline. And we're talking about Bud Light sales. It reports it at 26% here. It's more like 50. And here's the real stain. It is that all of these chain retail buyers, the Targets, the Walmarts, the Jewel Oscos, wherever you are in the country, they are the ones that must buy the product from distributors. And distributors are divided into 2 houses, Bud and Miller. You're either a red house as a distributor or a blue house as a distributor. And those distributors this is how they make their living, is on the backs of either being a primarily Budweiser distributor or primarily a Miller distributor. So the real issue here for AB InBev is that they have absolutely burned the trust of a vast network of chain retailers and a vast network. We're talking 60,000 employees strong, a vast network of distributors across the country who are the ones responsible for physically bringing the product and putting them into stores, not to mention are likely blue collar red voters, right, along the way. They have absolutely put them in a position of having to absorb all of the criticism.
Yeah, no, I
Right?
get it.
From
I get
every
it.
retail customer. So the statement here is that, ultimately the sort of critique that the
Here's what it comes down to. Keep your tatas of whatever, how you keep your tatas off my beer can. And I'm not a beer drinker, but I feel about this the same way I do when I don't watch a lot of television anymore. And when I watch a sports event, I don't want to be politicized. I want to watch the ball get thrown. I want to watch the guys run. I want to watch people dribble the basketball, shoot the hockey puck. I don't want to be told that I need to drink a transgender beer. And I don't particularly care. But somebody said there was something on social media the other day, some guy in a beard but looks kind of feminine, and he's got his camisole on. And if you don't like the way I look and something, or you're transphobic, and I'm like, okay, I'm transphobic. Deal with it. I just don't want to. I don't want to be compelled to care about everything. I've got only so much energy, and by commandeering or attempting to commandeering my regard, you're losing my respect.
Well, and this is why I'm upset with Tim, and Tim doesn't even know I exist, so he doesn't have any reason to care. But were he wiser as to the subject matter, he would see, and I've tried to elevate this message. But what Bud Light fell victim to by relocating its sales and marketing function to somewhat of a blue bubble, right, is that it fell victim to the exact same socio-political culture that craft beer has been dragged into over the last 10 years. There is none industry more woke than craft beer in the United States, bar none. And that's not to say every brewery.
No pun intended, bar none.
But that's not to say every brewery, but I am telling you that the Brewers Association, which I talked about before, which is sort of the trade organization du jour for craft beer in America, they have a diversity and inclusion partner on staff there. They are the ones that have offered these scholarships for diversity and inclusion and representation and equity and right? The lifeblood of craft beer culture is, or has been to date, a certain amount of wokeness. So what Bud Light has done by trying to absorb and acquire craft beer brands over the last 5 to 7 years, this is not a surprise. This is a market correction. Overall, this is a great thing. Bud Light stepped in its own mess, but you're not going to get an apology. The apology is in the stock price. The apology is in the lacking sales. The apology is in the lost market share, right? But what would be great is if this could be used as a moment to illuminate the systemic nature of this sort of thing throughout the beer industry everywhere, everywhere. But I'll get off my soapbox now, but that's where we are. And I'll keep tabs, but this is the first moment that I felt, okay, the right stuff is happening in response to that sort of marketing campaign. But we're not going to get anywhere if we're just going to stare at the behemoth that is the biggest lagging indicator available. These things turn like aircraft carriers, right? So this stuff has been embedded within the industry forever at this point.
Well, and you talk about lagging indicators, and I'm talking about a growing sense of intolerance, of always being needing to feeling politicized everywhere I turn. That every interaction is now going to have a surtax in the form of a demand that I recognize a hitherto unrecognized group and pay them my respect in the labeling and consumption of products. And as a consumer, I feel free to say, no, I don't care. And I don't want to be pandered to. I don't want to be lectured to. I don't want to be preached at. If I want a beer, which I mean, from your perspective as a craft brewery guy, I don't want them enough. But if I want a beer, I want it because it tastes good. I want it because I want to enjoy. Right. I want it because I want to kick back and I want to be me. And candidly, being me means that I don't have the right not to really give a shit about somebody else.
That's right.
And their attitude and their identity. Pool takes it a little too far, and it is a little ridiculous. Tim, I don't need an apology. I just need to be let alone. Hey, you talked about lagging indicators, and that we had this banner prepared before, so I thought you were teeing me to tip off something else. Speech and culture in American public education. So there's a kid, I don't recall the school district, but he went to school in a T-shirt that said there are only two genders, and he was sent home. And I found that interesting. There's another story in the paper today about individual teachers being requested to keep their use of pronouns from parents. In other words, I send Johnny to
Even,
school.
it's even, yeah, I was going to say it's even more than just not the use of pronouns, but the going by an entirely different identity, right? That
Yeah,
there may be a transition underway.
I send Johnny to school saying, "Have a good day, son." He gets to school. How is it? How are you today, young it? And young it says, "Oh, you look good in a skirt. Well, is there something you want to tell me about? Would you like to try my skirt on?" And before you know it, Johnny's becoming maybe Janie. And the school is encouraging the young man, but keeping that from the parents. I mean, that that's chilling to me. If we're going to have an ideologically driven curriculum that concludes that somehow that concludes whatever it is that we're reaching a conclusion on, and I'm not sure what that is, that somehow we are simply the sum of our desires, and whatever I desire with most is what I should become tomorrow. If that's what we're teaching in schools, I think parents are right to be outraged. And Mike, you made a really good point that I hadn't even thought about the other day. You probably do that every day. I'm just not smart enough to listen to you every day. But that is that the pandemic really sort of changed the nature of public education, because it used to be, I mean, I've raised three kids. Well, my wife raised three kids. I contributed financially and was entertainment on the weekends on those rare hours when I was home and awake. So let's be honest. But we raised three children. And when they went off to school, I didn't give a second thought to the cultural content of what they were being taught. I didn't worry about them being politicized. Now, they went to good schools, and we selected the schools because we knew they offered a quality education. But I trusted the educators to do the job of preparing my children for the future. And now all my kids, candidly, Mike, how old am I? I'm so old. All my kids are older than you. And I've got, grandchildren, two more on the way. Come October, I'll have 6 grandchildren.
That's
And
awesome.
so,
That's
it
awesome.
is kind of cool. It's neat to have lived this long. But what I see in my children is that they are now complete persons. They have the ability to get by in the world with or without me. Most days I think they prefer to have me around, at least the idea of me out there somewhere raising hell, being dad. But their education succeeded, and if I had a child today, I don't know that I'd have that same confidence. I don't know that I would trust that, because I just don't think a 6, 7, 8-year-old, gender should be part of what they're being taught, or that they're being taught to identify as this, that, or the other thing.
Well, this is going to sound this is going to sound really condescending, and I don't mean it in any other way than this. All teachers at every level, and historically teachers have been lumped into that category of teachers, doctors, EMS, first responders, police officers, etc., and as sort of service oriented heroes. But similar to this issue with Bud Light, I think that there's a recognition inherent in the culture right now that there's some stuff broken, and that traditionally the respect and reverence held for public school teachers, irrespective of the level, right, whether it's elementary, middle, or high school, were worthy of a general trust and a general respect. But what I am concerned with as a 33-year-old father of one so far is that I
keep
don't
working on the others. They say practice is perfect.
Yeah, well, perfect practice is perfect. Right? What I'm concerned with is that the teachers now are sort of my generation, my cohort, and I like to think that I know a little more about the millennial generation than I do the other generations that were my teachers. And to the extent these are the same people that are attempting to have some sort of moral or righteous high ground on being able to determine or discern what my son and or future daughter thinks she is in terms of biological sex and gender and identity and these things. I mean, these students, especially middle school, think about how suggestible these kids ultimately are.
Well, and listen, I'm looking at some of the chats. By the way, big news flash: Mike taught me how to read the Rumble chat, so now he's created a monster.
Everyone.
So it's me again. So I says, there are closets of clothes at some schools, so kids can change once they get to school. I mean, that to me, I would feel betrayed as a parent in the cloud says teachers aren't paid enough, so the selection pool gets shallow, and we end up with what we've got now, a bunch of SJWs, or social justice warriors. That may be true, but I think the problem runs deeper. I think the problem is that we're spending down the intellectual capital that we built over centuries and millennia by refusing to recognize the centrality of the classics, by refusing to recognize the centrality of the Judeo-Christian tradition. We've now gotten to the point where these are old themes for old listeners, but they resonate, at least with Mike and I. That's why how we found one another in the cosmos. The bottom has fallen out of pluralism. We're afraid to have meaningful discussions about things, about ideals that unite us. And those ideals used to be ideas about community, ideas about excellence, ideas about righteousness, ideas about justness, ideas about human nature, religious ideas about the proper sense of vocation and the relationship between man and God. Now it's all about how you relate to the needles sticking in your face, and what color hair you got, and what gender you identify as, and what the teacher has waiting for you apparently in the closet, so that when you go to the school, you can come out of the closet and be well dressed for the transgender story hour. This is just absolute insanity.
And how does it happen? I think that I'm having a bit of a revelation here, and maybe I'm overselling revelation, but I was just thinking, what skin do these teachers now have in the game? Historically, teachers, maintain their job and their credibility and their respect and reverence through graduating or helping matriculate classes of students who could look back and say, that teacher made a difference. That teacher really, really got more out of me than I thought I had to give, that sort of thing. And Norm, I think that you've had the same experience in your life. You've talked about it before, about the role of those few people. And I'm not saying that those people aren't out there. And I think that part of this conversation overlooks that there are there's a vast number of educators that still fit that mold. But with the emergence of this really heavy federal bureaucratic overlay of standards, testing standards, and No Child Left Behind, and diluting of curriculum, and this attack on merit to say that, a tradition of excellence is somehow
white supremacist,
right? Exclusionary. We'll say.
What was the school that was going to get rid of band and musical instruments because these reflected white supremacy?
That's out in the Olympia district in Washington State, right? Yeah. And that's what I'm referring to is if you overlay what teachers' real obligations are in the public sector these days, it's no surprise to me that there is really no skin in the game. There is no buy-in. There is no expectation that these teachers do anything transformative or innovative. And therein lies the void that is ultimately filled by some sort of self-righteous, I guess, proselytizing about something that isn't even real and isn't even within the purview of what we ask instructors and teachers to do day to day. So I think that the education system is being overhauled, whether it likes it or not.
So here we are. We've diagnosed the problem, and what's the solution?
We've talked a little bit about it. That's what I said. I think that the public education system is being overhauled, whether it likes it or not, and it's because of the pandemic. It's because of the transparency that was never afforded to parents, and in a recognition that things were going in a way that parents didn't recognize from their own experience.
Well, look,
it's going to students in these sort of voucher programs and budgets following students to go to whatever districts. Again, speaking of lagging indicators, the only way that we'll be able to see the change that's happening because of this is tracking it over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And I actually had a moment the other night when I was sitting around thinking about this topic in particular, because up until now, I've been thinking, how am I going to get my son the best primary education possible and then open up possibilities for him?
You're going to put him up for adoption as a starter. and if you're lucky, maybe he'll come to New England, but get him out of the South, get him new parents. But I digress.
But I'm hopeful that just skipping to the end, I'm hopeful that the education system begins to fix itself and unravel this BS by the time he's of age where I am considering these things around high school, preparatory academies, and then on to college. Because if you ask me right now, the value of college has never been lower, and it's never been more expensive to make that decision. Right. So those two variables are completely out of whack.
Have you considered homeschooling, you and your wife?
I've considered it. I think that as a conversation, homeschooling is a really tough topic to wrap yourself around when you've got two attorneys in the same house, busy with other things every day. But I have been surprised at how prevalent homeschool pods and resources are in this area. So it's not out of the question whatsoever. But it is something, this is a real decision. This isn't some imaginary theoretical set of facts and circumstances that we're wading through at this point, and then we just get to shove him off into the public education system. This is a real issue.
No, I mean, your son is lucky that he has you and your wife as parents. Those of us who came up on the rough side. I mean, I was raised by a single mom who didn't have an education. Hadn't graduated high school and struggled with, candidly, mental health issues. And so I was basically on my own. And so when she threw me out the door, she wasn't thinking about me, I don't think. I just went to school and got what I could get. And it was good enough, I guess, good enough to get me going. I wonder now what's going on when I see all the reports of all the violence in school and mental health among kids and gun violence. I mean, the culture seems to be spinning out of control. And I think we need to be a little bit more, we need to offer people some reason to live tomorrow, because today, I mean, we've been Normie and Mikey Downer. And sometimes I think you just got to call it as it is. And as you see it, things are dire out there. And there does need to be a national discussion around common norms of excellence and common norms of a good society. And we're trying here to provoke that discussion. We're trying to identify candidates who bring something meaningful to the table in their various political races, and the critical role of spotting BS, to call it BS, and to find other like-minded people and bring them in under the tent of reason is something that we can do.
Well, and it's something that I think is just a quick sort of, I guess, election 24 thought here, because I was listening while I was trying to get some yard work done yesterday afternoon late. I was listening to Joe Rogan. He had Dave Smith on his podcast. And if you're not familiar, Dave Smith is not only a comedian, but a libertarian political talk show host as well. And very well-read guy, very well-spoken guy. And, I was thinking while I was listening to them of how interesting it is that we have a legitimate Kennedy that has thrown into the ring for the Democrat Party in 2024, and yet there's no political capital, or there's no influence over that right now. And it got me thinking about, what's ridiculous at this point, Norm, is that even if you and I are having these conversations and we're helping illuminate other things for other people, which I sincerely hope we do, I'm learning as we go, having these conversations, but the issue of a debate, of a public debate.
Yeah, no, what's up with that? We can't have one this year? I mean,
what is it? What is it that we've just been like dragged sleepily into this new political reality where the winning candidate can get a record number of votes without even really being on the campaign trail, and then that same one is older than the average age, age of death, right? Like, how old do you live to be as a man in America these days? He's past that, and we're just assuming that he's going to be, he's already thrown his hat into the ring. He's the most likely to be reelected on the Democrat side of things, but they're the ones running.
There is a hunger for meaning, as Vivek Ramaswamy has pointed out, and there's a hunger for alternatives. And if Basement Joe intends to run from the basement again, and Donald intends to just ignore us all as he goes on another rage trip, it's just not going to work for me. We need severe conservative. Trump ducking debates too. Amen. I mean, let's get back to
severe conservative. Well done.
Yeah, I like that too. William F. Buckley there in his prime, back when he was editing the National Review. I'm sure there are journals of ideas or podcasts of ideas out there. We aspire to be one. We'd ask you to spread the word that we're here. We're looking forward to your comments and growing a community of reasonable minds that can shed light into the dark corners of American life, because, let's face it, the darkness descends and we are the bearers of light. So thank you for listening to Law and Legitimacy. We will be back tomorrow, God willing. Maybe it'll be day 80 something else, 80x plus, who knows? But thanks for listening. Give us good ratings wherever you find us. Spread the word.
Thumbs up on the video. The thumbs up on the video.
And Severe Conservative says he's a Whitlock Books customer too. So I know that means he's a Connecticut resident. Whitlock Farm Booksellers. Check it out online. That's a bookstore my wife and I own, with independent book dealer that's been present in New England for many decades, and we hope many decades to come.
Oh, we did a great podcast with your with Whitlock Books manager as well. She's a darling. Love that interview with her.
Meg Turner, yeah.
if you see them, thank your local beer distributor. Let them know that they still have your support. That's important, whether you think so or not. And you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, etc. Give us 5 stars over there. If you think to just make a quick rating, just do the 5 stars. You don't have to leave a comment. That's
and tomorrow, Mike, we're putting the pressure on you. Tomorrow, you're going to give us an illustration of what a good alternative to Bud Light is to drink. I want to see the can. I want to hear the pitch. I want to know where to go. Okay.
I can do that. Easy. That's easy money.
All right.
All right, Norm. See you tomorrow. See everybody.